What happened in Attica prison in 1971? The prisons are filled with notorious criminals. They break the rules of jail with no fear. The policemen are advised to be strict, to single out the rule breakers and to assert authority at all times. Any moment of leniency by law enforcement is viewed as a weakness by inmates. In such a situation, if the inmates gather together to stand for their own rights, who's at fault? The prisoners, the staff, or the system?
Attica was fear.
This is Robert's Insights, and today, we will look at a scenario where prisoners united themselves to deal with the bigger issue. While putting aside their differences, they made a strong group within themselves and challenged the police like never before. Imagine a prison where inmates, known for their individualistic and often hostile nature, decide to unite. They put aside their differences, their hatreds, and their rivalries to stand against the unjust system which has been suppressing them for long. This is exactly what happened in 1971. When the prison of Attica witnessed a massive riot, the prisoners controlled the area and held police guards as hostages. The news soon spread across the country, with headlines in major newspapers witnessing a strange case as prisoners held their teams of security and negotiations. The reason behind this uprising was none other than the unjust behavior towards the prisoners. They desired improved living conditions, which they believed was their fundamental right. The reason for this fallen standard of living for the inmates was the increased number of prisoners. The prison only had a capacity of 1,200 prisoners, but the population exceeded 2,243 inmates. In 1927, the prison of Attica was a place of unending tension and unrest. The cells were filled with notorious criminals who ruled the jail without fear. The guards were stern, instructed to be vigilant and assert their authority at all times. Any show of leniency was seen as a weakness, exploited by the inmates. The prison was like a gunpowder lying around, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The real threat wasn't just the individual troublemakers, but the potential for unity among the prisoners. If they ever decided to set aside their differences and unite, they could pose a huge challenge to the prison authorities. And that's exactly what happened in 1971. As the inmates realized their worsening situation, they put their differences aside and developed a consensus between them. They developed a list of demands prepared to present to concerned authorities. In July of 1971, a group of Attica inmates presented a list of mutually agreed 27 demands regarding the improvements in living conditions to State Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller. The demands included improvements in multiple areas of the prison, such as food provided, the quality of guards, rehabilitation programs, and in particular educational programs for the inmates. Alongside these, the inmates requested increased religious freedom and the ability to engage in political activities. However, the commission paid little to no attention and did not address any of their demands. Instead, Attica Warden Vincent Mancusi responded by adding additional restrictions to inmates' reading materials and personal belongings. This ignited a flame among the prisoners that resulted in a massive riot. The event that started the rebellion was a simple, everyday event. On Wednesday, 8 September 1971, two inmates fought during their recreation break, and a correctional officer came up to intervene. One inmate had already left, and the officer demanded the other to return to his cell, but the argument between the two intensified, and the inmate hit the officer. Looking at the situation, other inmates and officers joined in, and another inmate hit an officer. Before the events escalated to a new height, the officers were able to resolve it promptly. Later that evening, Warden Vincent Mancusi ordered the two inmates involved in the altercation to be taken to solitary confinement. But when the officers arrived at 5 Company to take the inmates away, other prisoners resisted. The other inmates in 5 Company shouted and threw things at the guards, and one inmate, William Ortiz, hit an officer with a can of soup. Ortiz was confined to his cell, but the unrest was far from over. The following morning, on September 9, 1971, the inmates of 5 Company were still upset and demanded to know what would happen to Ortiz. Officer Gordon Kelsey told them he didn't know and tried to continue the routine. As the inmates headed to breakfast, some managed to open Ortiz's cell door, and he joined them in the mess hall. When the command staff found out, they decided to return all of 5 company to their cells after breakfast. But they didn't inform all the correctional officers, leading to confusion. When officers led inmates out towards the recreation area after breakfast, both officers and inmates were surprised to find the doors locked. The inmates believed they were about to be punished, and chaos erupted. Some inmates attacked the guards and others tried to run away. The chaos spread to other nearby companies of inmates, and the uprising began. During this stage, several guards and inmates were injured. Officer William Quinn would die in the hospital 2 days later of injuries sustained during the initial riot. By noon, the situation had spiraled out of control. Correctional officers and police managed to secure about half the prison, while over 1,200 inmates controlled the other half, including the crucial D-yard and the central control room, known as Times Square. They held 42 officers and civilian employees as hostages. With their newfound control, the inmates secured their section of the prison and started to think ahead. They organized themselves, elected leaders in case a negotiation situation occurred, picked out fellow prisoners who were willing to serve as medics, and even formed a security team for protection. One prisoner, known as Big Black, took charge of the hostages and kept them safe with his articulation tactics. A young man named James Barkley, with exceptional oratory skills, became their spokesperson.
We are men! We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such.
The inmates drafted a list of demands to present before the officials. This draft basically had a list of complaints and suggestions that they deemed fit to present to the State Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller. The list, known as the Attica Liberation Faction Manifesto of Demands, included 30 points, such as better medical treatment, fair visitation rights, improved food quality, religious freedom, higher wages for inmate work, and access to professional training, newspapers, and books. They also called out the vile and vicious slave masters who oppressed them, such as the New York Governor, New York Corrections, and the United States Courts. Once the draft was ready, the next step was moving to the negotiation. The prisoners requested a team of outside observers to assist with negotiations. The observers included prominent figures like Tom Wicker of the New York Times, State Senator John Dunn, Attorney William Kunstler, and civil rights lawyer Herman Badillo. They hoped these observers would ensure fair negotiations, and the inmates would eventually enjoy their basic rights. Once the proposal was finalized and representatives were chosen, the negotiations officially began with Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald. Russell agreed to 28 of the inmates' demands, but refused to agree to amnesty for the inmates involved in the uprising or to fire the Attica warden. William Kunstler, a lawyer who agreed to represent the inmates in negotiations, called these two terms non-negotiable. Plus, Governor Rockefeller put salt on the wounds by refusing to even arrive at the prison or meet the inmates. Finally, the negotiation reached a deadlock. Desperate for a resolution, the inmates and observers continued to push for a peaceful settlement, but the authorities were preparing for a different approach. As the situation worsened, Oswald and Rockefeller agreed that Oswald would order the state police to retake the facility by force. On the night of Sunday, September 12, 1971, plans were made to retake the prison by force. Members of the observer team suggested to Oswald to give the inmates one final chance for a peaceful resolution. Oswald agreed but was told not to present it as an ultimatum, as Rockefeller did not want the inmates to realize that an assault was coming for them. At 8:25 a.m. on Monday, September 13, 1971, Oswald issued a statement to the inmates and instructed them to release the hostages and accept the proposed settlement within the hour. He did not disclose that negotiations had ended and that force would be used if they refused. Instead, he said, "I want to continue negotiations with you." When the inmates realized that Rockefeller had no interest in accepting their terms, they decided to take the worst road and declined the offer for negotiation. At this point, it seems that prisoners were shrewd enough to sense the wicked intentions of Oswald and Rockefeller. But were they successful in resisting the invading force? As unaware as the prisoners were about the attack, they were also getting ready for a fight. They knew the guards might try to storm the prison to take control again, so they started building defenses. They dug deep ditches around their area to make it harder for the guards to get in. They also made sharp metal fences that were electrified to shock anyone who touched them. To block the guards' view and protect themselves from bullets, they piled up dirt and metal tables to make walls. The most important part of the prison, where the bosses were, was made extra strong. By doing all this, the prisoners were showing the guards that they were serious and ready to fight back if anyone tried to hurt them or the hostages. What prisoners failed to conceive was that their showboating would cost them significantly. The prisoners took 8 guards and forced them to go to the highest part of the prison, the command center. They were surrounded by other prisoners who had made weapons out of things they found in the prison. Even though they had these guards, the prisoners said they didn't want to hurt them. They just wanted to keep them safe, so the guards wouldn't try to hurt the prisoners. Once everyone was in place, the person in charge of the guards, Oswald, told his men to start taking back the prison. On September 13, 1971, a tense situation at a prison in New York exploded into violence. At 9:46 a.m., tear gas was dropped into the yard, and hundreds of New York State police troopers, deputy sheriffs, park police, and correctional officers stormed the prison. They launched a massive attack on the prison yard where inmates were holding hostages. They opened fire into the smoke, using shotguns loaded with buckshot pellets. Some officers even used bullets that are banned in war because of the damage they cause. The assault was brutal, and within minutes, the prison was retaken. By 10:05 a.m., the facility was secured, but the cost was high. Law enforcement had shot at least 128 men, killing 29 inmates and 10 hostages. This attack came after days of a standoff between inmates and authorities. While tragic, the use of force by officers with these powerful weapons led to the deaths of not only inmates, but also innocent hostages. 39 people were killed in just over 15 minutes. This event sparked outrage and raised serious questions about how authorities handle prison uprisings. Survivors of the Attica prison uprising claimed that the authorities deliberately targeted and killed the leaders of the rebellion. A doctor who treated the injured inmates reported seeing many of the ringleaders shot at close range, some while surrendering with their hands raised and others while lying defenseless on the ground. Among those allegedly executed was Elliot James L.D. Barkley, a prominent figure in the news coverage of the uprising. Witnesses testified that Barkley was alive after the initial takeover by authorities, but was later hunted down and shot in the back. Another victim was Sam Melville, a radical activist and key organizer of the inmate demands. He was reportedly shot while surrendering with his hands in the air. With so much ammunition being used and casualties being reported, it brings us to the realization of how big this prison riot was in comparison with other major events of that time frame. The aftermath of the Attica prison uprising revealed a tragic loss of life. In addition to the inmates killed during the rebellion itself, the violence continued. One correctional officer died at the hands of inmates during the initial uprising, and 3 inmates were killed by their fellow prisoners before authorities regained control. Tragically, 10 hostages lost their lives due to gunfire from state troopers and soldiers during the retaking of the prison. The New York State Special Commission on Attica issued a damning report, labeling the state's assault on the prison as the bloodiest single-day conflict on American soil since the Civil War, excluding the massacres of Native Americans in the late 19th century. This stark comparison underscored the severity and brutality of the events at Attica. The violent retaking of Attica prison by state forces was followed by a broken effort to manage public perception. Officials, including those in positions of power like Oswald and Rockefeller, initially spread a false narrative that inmates had brutally murdered the hostages, their throats slit. This gruesome and unfounded claim was widely disseminated through the media, shaping public opinion. However, the truth quickly came to light. Within 24 hours, medical examiners conclusively determined that all hostages had died from gunshot wounds inflicted by law enforcement. This contradiction exposed the state's attempt to deceive the public. Despite the overwhelming evidence, officials failed to correct the false information, allowing harmful rumors and misinformation to persist,
making this the bloodiest prison incident the country has seen in 4 decades.
After successfully retaking the authority of the prison, troopers and prison officers were engaged in violent and humiliating revenge. Inmates were forced to strip naked and crawl through mud, broken glass, and latrines. They were then directed into the prison, where they had to run naked through hallways lined with enraged officers who beat them and insulted them with racial slurs. Some inmates, including leaders like Frank Smith, faced additional repercussions, such as repeated physical abuse and solitary confinement. Several days after the uprising ended, doctors who treated wounds of inmates reported further evidence of beatings that occurred after the initial operation, which indicated that inmates were subject to further physical torture once the control had been established by the police. The Attica prison uprising of 1971 was a turning point in the history of American prisons. While the prison was eventually retaken by authorities, the event left a profound mark on the nation. The uprising sparked a wave of similar protests and riots in prisons across the country, from New York to Georgia. This surge in prison unrest highlighted the deep-rooted problems within the correctional system. The incident also altered public opinion and increased awareness of prisoner rights. Activists and celebrities rallied behind the inmates, demanding better conditions and treatment. Though the immediate aftermath was marked by blood, the Attica uprising ultimately contributed to a broader conversation about prison reform in the United States. Essentially, the Attica riot became a symbol of the struggle for prisoner rights and exposed the severe flaws in the American prison system. Its legacy continues to shape discussions about prison conditions and reforms to this day. On the evening of September 17th, the militant left-wing armed resistance force known as Weather Underground retaliated by exploding a bomb near the New York Department of Corrections office, close to Commissioner Oswald's office. They issued a statement calling the prison system an example of how a society run by white racists maintains its control, emphasizing that white supremacy was a central issue and highlighting the racial slurs used by the prison guards against the black men. In response to the public response and condemnation of authorities, Governor Rockefeller set up the New York State Special Commission on Attica in November 1971, appointing NYU Law School Dean Robert B. McKay as chair. Famously known as the McKay Commission, it was tasked with investigating the events leading up to, during, and following the Attica uprising. The commission's report, released in September 1972, criticized Rockefeller, the Department of Corrections, and the New York State Police for their handling of the prison retaking and for failing to protect inmates from retaliation after the riot had ended. Besides the justice that later served and those who committed atrocities on prisoners were shamed publicly, the changes in the prison system took place in a while. As a result of the Attica uprising, the New York State Department of Corrections made several improvements, such as increasing access to showers, soap, medical care, and family visits. They introduced a grievance procedure that allowed inmates to report staff violations of policy and established liaison committees where elected inmate representatives could communicate with prison officials. Funding was provided to prisoners' legal services to give inmates legal assistance, access to higher education was expanded, and more religious freedoms were granted. Although these did not last for a long time, during the tough-on-crime era of the 1980s and 1990s, many of these advancements were rolled back. The 1994 crime bill ended with leaving inmates without any educational opportunities. The prison population in New York increased dramatically from 12,500 at the time of the Attica uprising to 72,600 by 1999, resulting in overcrowding. The incident at Attica is remarkable. It represents the idea that unity among groups could lead to greater changes, no matter how strong the opposing forces are. Other than that, it also teaches us about the idea that fighting for our fundamental rights requires sacrifice, even of our own lives. The story of Attica continues to inspire and provoke thought about justice, human rights, and the power of collective action. Comment below the video and let us know about your thoughts on the prison riot of Attica. We hope you enjoyed the video and appreciate our content. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on a new story. And until next time, stay curious.